Roy Benavides was 33 years old on the morning of May 2nd, 1968, when he heard his friends dying over the radio. He was sitting in a helicopter at the forward operating base near Loc Ninh, cleaning his rifle, his hands moving through the familiar ritual of disassembly and reassembly while his mind drifted somewhere else. The humid air pressed against his skin like a wet blanket. Sweat pooled in the small of his back, soaked through his fatigue shirt. Around him, other soldiers moved through their routines, checking equipment, smoking cigarettes, writing letters home that might never be sent. The war had a rhythm here, a daily cadence of boredom punctuated by moments of absolute terror. Then the radio crackled to life, and everything changed. Taking heavy fire. Can't hold. Multiple wounded. The voice was breaking apart, half drowned in static and panic, but Benavides recognized it. Someone he knew. Someone he'd trained with, shared meals with, laughed with during the brief moments when laughter was still possible in this green hell. The voice belonged to a man trapped somewhere in the jungle with 11 others, pinned down by an enemy force that outnumbered them 100 to 1. Benavides stopped cleaning his rifle. His hands went still. Around him, other soldiers were listening too, their faces carefully blank, the way soldiers' faces get when they're hearing something they don't want to acknowledge. Everyone knew what that radio call meant. Everyone understood the mathematics of the situation. 12 men surrounded, running out of ammunition, bleeding out in the mud while the enemy closed in like a tightening fist. 2 helicopters had already tried to extract them. Both had been driven back by withering fire, their fuselages torn open by bullets, hydraulic fluid streaming behind them. The pilots had reported what everyone already knew. It was suicide to go back. The landing zone was too hot. The enemy had it zeroed in. Anyone who went down there wasn't coming back. Benavides stood up. He wasn't assigned to this mission. He wasn't ordered to go. But his body was moving before his mind caught up, driven by something deeper than thought, more fundamental than orders. He walked toward the helicopter, being prepped for a third attempt, his boots crunching on the red dirt, his heart hammering in his chest. The pilot saw him coming and shook his head. "We're just doing a flyover," he said, his voice tight. "Dropping supplies. We're not landing. It's too hot." Benavides didn't argue. He climbed aboard, carrying only his medical bag and a knife. No helmet, no elaborate plan. Just the simple, terrible arithmetic of loyalty. His friends were dying and he was still breathing. Everything else was noise. He was born into poverty in South Texas, the son of a Mexican-American sharecropper and a Yaqui Indian mother. His father died when he was 7. His mother died when he was 8. He was raised by relatives who had little more than determination and the kind of faith that comes from having nothing else to believe in. He picked cotton as a child, his small hands bleeding in the fields under the brutal Texas sun, learning early that the world didn't owe him anything, that survival was something you earned, one brutal day at a time. When he was old enough, he joined the army, not out of patriotism or some abstract sense of duty, but because it was a way out. A way to become something more than another brown kid with dirt under his fingernails and no future. The army gave him structure, purpose, a place where his willingness to endure pain was an asset rather than just another fact of life. He'd been wounded before, badly. In 1965, he stepped on a landmine during a patrol. The explosion shattered his legs, his back, his pelvis. The doctors told him he'd never walk again. For months, he lay in a hospital bed, his body broken, useless. But Benavides had learned something in those cotton fields, something the doctors with their degrees and their certainty didn't understand. Pain was just another kind of work, and he'd never been afraid of work. Late at night, when the nurses weren't watching, he'd force himself out of bed. He'd drag his useless legs, fall, vomit from the agony, and then do it again. The pain was extraordinary, a white-hot fire that lived in his bones. But he kept going. Eventually, impossibly, he walked, then he ran. Then he lied to the medical board, hid the chronic pain that still lived in his legs like buried shrapnel, and returned to active duty. Now, he was a Special Forces NCO, a Green Beret, trained in languages and medicine and the dark arts of unconventional warfare. But all that training, all that discipline, all those skills came down to something simpler, something he'd learned long before the army. You don't abandon your people. Not ever. Not for any reason. Because if you do, you have to live with it forever, and some weights are too heavy to carry. The Huey lifted off, rotors beating the humid air into submission. Benavidez sat in the open door, his legs dangling over the side, watching the jungle slide past below. The canopy was unbroken green, hiding everything: trails, tunnels, enemy soldiers, the 12 men who were running out of time. The pilot was pushing the helicopter hard, weaving between the trees, dropping fast. In the cockpit, Benavidez could see the crew chief's face, pale and tight with fear. They came over the clearing, and Benavidez saw it. Bodies scattered across the mud, soldiers hunched behind fallen logs, muzzle flashes winking from the tree line. Tracer rounds arced up toward the helicopter, bright streaks of red and green, and the fuselage shuddered as bullets punched through aluminum. The door gunner was firing back, his M60 chattering, spent brass cascading onto the floor. The pilot was screaming into his headset. "We're not landing! We're not landing!" Benavidez didn't wait for permission. The helicopter was still 6 feet off the ground, still moving when he jumped. He hit the mud hard, his old injuries flaring with pain, and rolled. Bullets kicked up dirt around him, snapping past his head like angry insects. He ran toward the perimeter, low and fast, his medical bag clutched to his chest, his lungs burning. He threw himself behind a fallen tree where 3 wounded men lay bleeding into the earth. One of them looked up at him, his face pale with shock, eyes wide with disbelief. "Roy, what the fuck are you doing here?" Benavidez didn't answer. He was already opening his medical bag, his hands moving with practiced efficiency, muscle memory taking over. The first man had a sucking chest wound, blood bubbling from the hole with each breath. Benavidez pressed a field dressing against it, applying pressure, trying to seal the wound. The man was making a sound like a broken engine, each breath a wet gurgle. His eyes were rolling back, his skin going gray. "Stay with me," Benavidez said, his voice steady despite the chaos around him. "You're going home, you hear me? You're going home." The second man had taken shrapnel to the face and arms, his uniform soaked with blood. Benavidez tied off a tourniquet on his arm, injected morphine into his thigh. The man was conscious, but going into shock, shaking uncontrollably. Benavidez moved to the third man, working quickly. His mind narrowed to a single focus. Stop the bleeding, keep them breathing, keep them alive. Around him, the world was disintegrating into chaos. The team's perimeter was collapsing. Enemy soldiers were pushing through the jungle, their AK-47s chattering, grenades exploding in bright flowers of dirt and shrapnel. The Americans were running out of ammunition, firing in short, desperate bursts, trying to make every round count. The team leader, Sergeant Leroy Wright, was still directing fire despite the bullet in his leg, his voice hoarse but steady. But everyone could see the truth written in the mud and blood. They had minutes, not hours. Benavidez finished with the third man and moved to the next. There were more wounded, too many wounded. He worked mechanically, his training overriding the fear that lived in his chest like a cold stone. Bandage, tourniquet, morphine. Move to the next man. Don't think about the bullet snapping past your head. Don't think about the grenade that just exploded 10 feet away, showering you with hot metal. Don't think about anything except the next wounded soldier, the next life you might save. The radio operator went down, hit in the neck. He collapsed forward, the radio still strapped to his back. Benavidez ran to him, sliding through the mud. Blood was pulsing from the wound in rhythm with the man's heartbeat. Benavidez pressed his hand against it, feeling hot blood squeeze between his fingers. With his other hand, he grabbed the radio handset. "We need immediate extraction. Multiple wounded. We can't hold." The pilot's voice came back, tight with stress and barely controlled panic. "We're taking too much fire. We can't land." "You have to land. These men are dying." A pause, the sound of rotors and distant gunfire. Then, "We're coming in. Pop smoke." Benavidez grabbed a smoke grenade from the radio operator's web gear and threw it into the clearing. Purple smoke billowed up, marking the landing zone, a beacon in the green chaos. The Huey came in low and fast, its skids barely touching the ground, the rotors whipping the smoke into spirals. Benavidez started dragging the wounded toward it. The first man was dead weight, unconscious, his body limp. Benavidez grabbed him by the web gear and hauled him across the mud, his back exposed to the tree line. Bullets whipped past him. Something hot and sharp sliced across his scalp, and blood poured down his face, filling his eyes, blinding him. He wiped it away with his forearm and kept moving. He loaded the first man into the helicopter and turned back. The second man was trying to crawl, dragging himself with his arms, his legs useless. Benavidez grabbed him and pulled him toward the helicopter. A grenade exploded nearby, and shrapnel tore into Benavidez's leg. The impact knocked him down. He tasted dirt and blood. His leg was screaming at him, a spike of agony that made his vision gray out. He got up and kept moving. Another man loaded, then another. The enemy fire was intensifying, a storm of metal and hate. The helicopter was taking hits, the fuselage punching full of holes. The pilot was yelling at him to hurry, to get in. They had to go now, but there were more wounded, always more wounded. Sergeant Wright was trying to help, dragging himself across the ground despite his shattered leg. Together, they got another man into the helicopter. Then Benavidez saw movement in the tree line, enemy soldiers breaking through the perimeter, running toward them in a ragged line. He grabbed an AK-47 from a dead NVA soldier and opened fire. The rifle bucked in his hands. 2 enemy soldiers went down, then 3. But there were more, always more. A bullet hit him in the abdomen. The impact folded him over, a spike of agony that stole his breath and turned his legs to water. He fell to his knees, blood soaking through his uniform, hot and sticky. For a moment, everything went gray and distant. He could hear his heartbeat, loud and irregular, and he thought with strange clarity, "This is it. This is where it ends." But then he heard someone screaming for help, and his body moved before his mind could catch up. He stood, swaying, the world tilting around him, and stumbled toward the voice. Another wounded man, trapped in the open, exposed to enemy fire. Benavidez grabbed him by the web gear and dragged him back toward the helicopter. His vision was tunneling, narrowing to a gray circle. Each step was an act of will that defied every signal his body was sending, every instinct screaming at him to stop, to lie down, to let go. He got the man to the helicopter and turned back. More wounded. The helicopter crew was yelling at him, gesturing frantically, but he couldn't hear them over the gunfire and the roaring in his ears. He stumbled back into the clearing, back into the storm of bullets and explosions. His legs weren't working properly anymore. He couldn't feel them, couldn't trust them. But he kept moving, dragging men toward the helicopter one by one, leaving a trail of blood in the mud. He'd lost count of how many times he'd been hit. His uniform was shredded, soaked with blood, his own and others. His hands were slippery with it, red and sticky. But he kept moving, kept dragging men toward salvation, kept firing at the enemy soldiers who were now inside the perimeter, fighting hand to hand in the mud and smoke. An NVA soldier rushed him with a bayonet. Benavidez tried to raise his rifle, but his arms wouldn't respond. They hung at his sides, useless, dead weight. The bayonet plunged into his back, a cold shock of metal between his ribs, and he fell forward. The enemy soldier fell on top of him, trying to finish him, the bayonet rising and falling. Benavidez couldn't feel his legs anymore. His arms were weak, trembling, but he still had his knife. With the last of his strength, he pulled it from its sheath and drove it into the enemy soldier's side. Again and again and again, until the man went limp and heavy on top of him. Benavidez pushed the body off and tried to stand. He couldn't. His legs were gone, his body a broken machine, but there were still wounded men on the ground, still men who needed him. He began to crawl, dragging himself through the mud with his elbows, his fingernails digging into the earth, leaving a trail of blood behind him like a wounded animal. His vision was fading, the world reduced to a narrow tunnel of grey light. He could hear the helicopter rotors, the sound of gunfire, someone shouting his name. But it all seemed very far away, as if he were underwater, sinking slowly into darkness. Hands grabbed him, lifted him. He was being carried toward the helicopter. He tried to tell them to get the others first, but his voice wouldn't work. Blood filled his mouth, thick and metallic. He could feel himself slipping away, his consciousness fragmenting like broken glass, scattering into the mud. The helicopter lifted off, and through the open door, he could see the jungle falling away below, green and endless, hiding all its secrets. He'd been on the ground for 6 hours. In that time, he'd been shot 7 times, hit by shrapnel from multiple grenades, bayoneted and beaten. He had 37 separate puncture wounds. His intestines were hanging out of his body. One lung was collapsed. He'd lost so much blood that when they loaded him onto the helicopter, the medics couldn't find a pulse. They thought he was dead. They zipped him into a body bag. But then, as the doctor was about to close the bag completely, Benavidez moved. He couldn't speak. His jaw was broken, his throat filled with blood. But he managed to spit in the doctor's face, a final act of defiance, a way of saying, "I'm still here, I'm still alive, I'm not done yet." The doctor unzipped the bag and went back to work. Benavidez spent a year in hospitals, undergoing surgery after surgery. The doctors said he'd never walk again. They'd said that before, after the landmine. He proved them wrong again, dragging himself out of bed when no one was watching, forcing his broken body to remember what it meant to stand, to move, to live. The pain was worse than anything he'd experienced in the jungle, a constant companion that never left, that woke him screaming in the night, but he endured it the way he'd endured everything else in his life, with stubborn, silent determination. Of the 12 men on that team, 8 survived because of him. The 4 who died were killed before he arrived in the initial ambush. Every man he reached, every man he touched, lived. The helicopter crew survived. The classified documents the team had been carrying were recovered. Intelligence that would save other lives in other battles. The enemy battalion that had ambushed the team was disrupted. Their plans compromised. But numbers don't capture what happened in that clearing. Statistics can't measure the moment when a man decides to jump from a helicopter into hell because his friends are dying. They can't quantify the will it takes to keep moving when your body is destroyed, when every nerve is screaming at you to stop, when death would be easier and more merciful than the next step. For 13 years, Roy Benavidez's actions that day were classified. The paperwork was lost, buried in the bureaucratic chaos of a war the country wanted to forget. He received the Distinguished Service Cross, but the witnesses to his actions were scattered, some dead, some missing, some trying to forget. It wasn't until 1980 when the survivors finally gathered and told their stories, when the documentation was reconstructed piece by piece, that the full truth emerged. President Ronald Reagan presented him with the Medal of Honor in 1981, 13 years after the fact. During the ceremony, Reagan looked at the citation, looked at Benavidez, and said, "If the story of his heroism were a movie script, you would not believe it. But it wasn't a script. It was 6 hours in a jungle clearing where a man refused to let his friends die alone, where he fought not for glory or country or abstract ideals, but for something more fundamental, the knowledge that when someone screams your name in the darkness, you answer, you go, even if it kills you, especially if it kills you." Benavides lived until 1998, dying of diabetes-related complications at the age of 63. He spent his later years speaking to schools and military groups, telling his story not to glorify war. He'd seen too much of war's ugliness for that, but to honor the men who fought beside him. He never called himself a hero. When people asked him why he did it, why he jumped from that helicopter, his answer was always the same, simple and devastating in its honesty. They were my friends. 3 words that contain everything. The whole terrible, beautiful truth of what humans are capable of when pushed beyond the limits of flesh and fear. Not superhuman strength or invulnerability, but something more profound and more fragile. The refusal to abandon each other, even when abandonment would be reasonable, even when staying means dying. The jungle at Loch Nint is quiet now. The trees have grown over the clearing where 12 men fought for their lives. The blood has long since washed away, absorbed into the earth, feeding the roots of trees that don't remember and don't care. But the story remains, passed down through military academies and special forces training. A reminder that heroism isn't about fearlessness or invulnerability. It's about the decision to answer when it would be easier to turn away. The choice to run toward the fire when every instinct screams to run from it. The willingness to break yourself so that others might remain whole. Roy Benavides was shot 37 times. He was bayoneted. He was broken in ways that should have killed him 10 times over. But for 6 hours, he kept moving, kept fighting, kept saving lives. Not because he was fearless. The fear was always there, cold and sharp, living in his chest like a stone. Not because he didn't feel pain. The pain was unbearable, extraordinary, beyond anything most humans will ever experience. But because somewhere in his core, in that place where character is forged in poverty and loss and stubborn refusal to quit, he'd learned a simple truth. Some things matter more than survival. He didn't fight to be a hero. He fought because someone was screaming his name, and he couldn't live with the silence that would follow if he did nothing. In the end, that's all heroism ever is, the decision to answer when it would be easier to turn away. The choice to stand when falling would be rational, the willingness to sacrifice everything for people who matter, even when, especially when, the cost is unbearable. 6 hours, 37 wounds, 8 lives saved, 1 man who refused to die until his work was done. That's the story. Not a myth. Not a legend. Just the terrible, beautiful truth of what humans can do when they decide that some things, some people, are worth dying for.